So that to me was wasn't implicit. I mean, it wasn't explicit in the book, but if you read between the lines, you would find it. Is how the very onset, one of the things that gave the European access into Africa was how they were able to change the taste the African elites. And I've been thinking about this thing before. I mean, I've read this book before. I've read it years ago, and in the middle of the readings I've done, like I've read other things, and I know I've mentioned this on the call before about like, especially in this day and age of AI, what will really make you stand out is not how much information you're able to pump out, but your taste for what is good. And I think I wholeheartedly believe that whoever controls your taste, that the taste is not something tangible. It's not by taste. I don't mean like what your tongue picks, but like just how you're able to evaluate what is good, what is desirable. The Europeans actually did that in the beginning. So, and obviously, when they met with the African elites, they were not meeting. I mean, of course, when they first met with the Africans, they were not meeting with the like regular African people. They were meeting with the kings and things like that, and they would give them these imported clothes. I know there was one quote that Walter Rodney put in the book where he was talking about a former slave that was just lamenting how they were exchanged for scarlet. I'm paraphrasing myself, paraphrases wrong. That's, you reduce an entire human being to just scarlet. Scarlet is red cloth. Like you deem a red cloth, a cloth that is dyed in red, so valuable that you think that is worth exchanging a human being for. Prior to European contacts, like people would have, of course, there were wars, there were fights, there were actual people during war, but what people did with captives then, at first they would kill them, then later they started realizing that I mean, this is free manpower, right? So they started diverting their efforts towards farms, and in a way, those labor moved from how Ibadan started and how all these balogons they had, they converted the thieves into serfs, and some of these serfs actually served as warriors. And land started becoming allocated, land in Ibadan started being allocated to these warriors, and these warriors were actually they were initially former slaves. So prior to slave trade, that was what was happening. There was displacements, there was conflicts, there was displacement, but the manpower on was still remained in Africa. So I mean, I'm jumping the gun a bit, but the main thing I wanted to highlight was that taste. Taste. The European came here, and Africans that they did with slaves before was to convert them. Either at first they were killing them, then later they converted them to productive sources of labor. Then the Europeans came and then started bringing imported clothes, started bringing gin, and at some point later started bringing in firearms. And it got to a point where the elites tasted and had contact with these things, and they were like, you know what, this is actually good, and let us get this thing no matter what it costs us. And unfortunately, it turned out that what it costs them was slaves. So yes, the Europeans were very much complicit in the whole slavery thing. They really drained Africa, and I think I'll talk about that a bit more later. However, the African elites also were equally complicit, because at the very beginning they were equally complicit, although later along the line they found out a bit too late what was going on, and many of the kings that tried to pull back away from the slavery. I know the king of Congo was an example. I think king of Benin also was example. Benin actually banned the Portuguese from coming into Benin Kingdom, and it wasn't until 300 years later when the British created an excuse that they are doing human sacrifice in Benin, so they used that as an excuse, and then they went to overcome the kingdom. But yeah, bottom line, first thing first, the Europeans shifted the taste of Africans, and this taste thing I think is still happening today, because today Nigerians I can speak more about how a Nigerian, like, we don't like local rice. Our taste has shifted to the imported rice. I have a contact on my WhatsApp. It's always marketing dogs, and the dogs is not his marketing is not the what we call local dogs in quotes, but this imported cane corso, and these dogs go for crazy prices, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million for a dog. Why? Because it's imported. So I'm just really like the Europeans really did they changed this because again I'm a psychologist, right? And I think about that thing like taste. When they change your taste, they change your behavior. So the elites, the taste of the elites was first changed, and then it's filtered down, all the way down the regular population. And at that point, there's no more demand for the local things. There's no more demand for and there's a slippery slope from that point because when you start tasting, when you start acquiring a taste for European commodities, the next thing is that they start bringing in their values to you, and then you feel that if their commodities are superior to my commodities, then definitely their values are superior to my values, and that's played out a lot of time before the. I mean, of course, obviously the Europeans also did. They were intentional about changing the values of Africans. There are some places where that worked out fine. For instance, things like killing of twins. That was a that was like an African value, like grounded in superstitious beliefs, and then Catholic missionaries came in, and because of the change in because of the change in values, they were able to stop those kind of things. But that was one of the few good sides of okay, it makes sense to change the values here. But on the downside, you have the establishment of an educated African middle class that started thinking of themselves more as Europeans, and that's a crazy thing. There's a quote in the book where the Spanish, although Walter Rodney dismissed that as true, it was saying that the Spanish were writing about their educational curriculum, that it was so good that there was a Spanish Guinea. I think that's Equatorial Guinea, or I might be getting it wrong, but they were talking about how the Spanish were boasting about how much they've trained the Africans so much that they see themselves, they love the Spanish more than the Spanish love themselves, and that is just mind blowing. How you because you are in charge of the educational system of particular people, and you start brainwashing them to the point that they start seeing the Europeans as superior. They start seeing the Europeans as masters. They start see this. They see European as a standard to aspire to attain. And just like the kings who had initial contact with the Europeans and would sell Africans to the Europeans, many of these people who had adopted the European value, sometimes the goal of the Europeans through their education was to shape the mind of Africans to either number one to be docile and just be receptive, or to see the European as a standard to aspire towards. And for some people, they stopped at that level where they started seeing themselves when they go to school. They started seeing themselves as superior to the Africans that didn't go to school. However, what the Europeans did not expect was that as the tastes of Africans kept on changing and kept on changing, they started having a taste for what we call like all these abstract values. So something like equality. There are things. Equality is something that the Africans learnt in this. By the time you read by the time you are like liberally trained, you start seeing concepts like justice. You start seeing concepts like equality. You start seeing concepts like liberalism. At, at that point, the Europeans try to draw the line that no, that doesn't apply to you. But by that point, so the Africans were educated, and then they were like, if this thing applies to you guys as Europeans, then I mean, there's a disconnect between how you are acting and the ideals that you say should govern the world. So they embraced those ideals, and that's one of the things that contributed to the nationalists in the late 50s and early 60s. So that was the first thing. Again, many of these things I said is Walter Rodney didn't explicitly say it, but if you read between the lines, you'll see it.